Hi, welcome back to our study, Book of Esther. I'm glad that you tuned in to join us today. We will be looking at, as I said, the Book of Esther. Today we'll be looking at chapters 7 and 8. So if you have your Bibles handy, you might want to get your Bible open to Esther chapter 7. We're going to be reading from that chapter in just a few moments. And we're going to be looking over some questions that have to do with the events that take place in those two chapters. As you know, we've been doing a continuing study through the book, learning as much as we can from the life of Esther and how it applies to us today as women in the church. We can learn many important lessons from Esther, as we've already learned and as we're going to continue to learn today. And I hope that you have found those interesting and profitable. She's one of the most notable women characters in the Bible, in the Old Testament specifically. And as we've said before, only one of two women who have a book named after her in the Old Testament. Esther lived during the Persian Empire when it was at the height of its power. At the time, it was the mightiest and most powerful and richest kingdom in the then known world. And they had conquered all of the surrounding areas that had once belonged to the children of Israel and then to Babylon. So they had a huge kingdom, as we've said before, 127 provinces that extended north all the way up into Syria, all the way south into Ethiopia, in Egypt, and then west to the Mediterranean Sea, and east over to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So they had a huge kingdom over which King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, depending on which translation you're reading from, was king. He chose Esther, as you know, to be his queen after he had banished the first queen that he had for failure to obey a command to come and present herself to a group of men that he was entertaining. Esther has now been queen for a few years. She has never revealed her ethnicity at this time. So if there were any in the palace that knew of her ethnicity, it would only have been the servants that waited on her. The king is not aware of it. Haman is not aware of it. And she goes about her business of queen separately, for the most part, from what the king's official business is. So she does not know a lot of the day-to-day official businesses that take place in the kingdom. All right, at the beginning of chapter 7, we see Haman and the king coming to the second banquet that Esther has invited them to. Remember that she went in to plead with the king if he could please come to a banquet, which he did with Haman. They had a banquet of wine. And at the end of that banquet, she promised that she would tell the king her request on the next day if he would come to another banquet of feasting and wine, which would have been the finest of the land, the finest wines and food delicacies of that time. So she's prepared this wonderful feast for Haman and the king. She's going to keep them at ease. She's going to help them to feel relaxed and welcomed. She's going to be in great composure, as we're going to see. She keeps herself held together. She doesn't reveal any type of emotional stress or distress. She is conducting herself as an official queen would do so. So we begin in verse 1 of chapter 7, reading, "So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again says to Esther, 'What is your question, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done.'" So again, the king repeats the same thing he had done at the first banquet and the first time she approached him. "Whatever your request is, I am willing to grant it, up to half of my kingdom," which, as I mentioned, would have been quite large. It's a very generous offer. He has no idea at this point what Esther's request will be. Haman is there being entertained by the queen. He thinks he's really officially made it in the kingdom. He's now the only other person in this banquet with the king, and he sees that as a good sign for his position in the kingdom. He's feeling pretty sure of himself, as you know. The only flaw in the ointment for him is the fact that Mordecai refused to bow down and pay homage to him when he passed by. Other than that, he feels pretty secure in his position in the kingdom. So in verse 3, we begin to read how Esther words her request. And my first question is, we're going to describe how Esther worded her request to the king, and how did Esther's wisdom in this way make the difference with the king? So we'll start reading in verse 3, where the Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Had we been sold as slaves, male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So let's look at how Esther has worded this request. Very respectfully, with great honor and dignity. She's submitting it with a, "If I have pleased you, king, if it pleases you." So she's leaving the decision completely up to the king as to whether he will or will not fulfill this request. She words it in such a way that it is non-threatening, non-demanding, simply a request that she very simply words that she would like to save the life of herself and her people. So this is the first time now that she's revealing her ethnicity to the king and, of course, to Haman, who's there listening. She's not revealed this before, so this is when the king first becomes aware that his queen. All right, so how would the king have responded to such a very diplomatic, very submissive, very respectful? I think this would have definitely made it a difference in how the king listened. He would have certainly, his interest has been piqued because she's waited 2 days to tell him. Interested and curious as to know what is going on and what this request is about. So that definitely made the difference in whether the king was going to listen, first of all, and second, grant her request. The king's decree, as we know, which he had no way of knowing, of course, at the time, but it had threatened not only the lives of all the Jews in his kingdom, but actually the life of his queen. He did not know that at the beginning when he first gave Haman the permission to write the decree. The other interesting thing we want to note is in verse 4, where she makes reference to if her people had been sold into slavery to another nation, more than likely, she would have been fine with that. She would not have come and made a request for people in that case, because their lives would have been preserved. But she does mention to the king that the loss of the Jewish nation or newish Jewish people in the kingdom would have been a great loss to the king, because there are probably thousands of Jews living throughout the 127 provinces of his kingdom, which, remember, would have included Jerusalem and the land surrounding that area in Judah, where many of the Jews had returned to rebuild. So she makes the point that if it were just a matter of our people being sold into slavery, I would have remained silent. She was willing to accept that they had already been living in a foreign country as captives for all these years anyway. So I think that also impressed the king into recognizing that this request was not frivolous. It wasn't simply that she wanted her people to be treated special in any way or different from any of the people in the kingdom, but she simply did not want them annihilated as Haman's plan was going to do. So let's go on reading then in verse 5 and see what the king's response is. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? And where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. All right, so what has King Ahasuerus just found out? He's found out a lot of things here in this few moments of time that he's going to have to face as a very, very harsh reality in his rule as king. Many times in our lives, we have to face harsh realities, things that happen to us that we did not expect, realities that we have to adjust to, we have to figure out how to respond to, and we have to adjust our lives accordingly. In this case, King Ahasuerus is finding out that the man whom he trusted and placed great authority in has indeed ended up being untrustworthy, deceitful, and probably in some ways betrayal. This is not what the king thought the decree was about, apparently. Of course, remember, he did no investigation into what people exactly it was that Haman was referring to. All he heard was that there was a people in his kingdom that were not obeying his commands, and he didn't want that, of course. So he doesn't know anything else beyond that until Esther reveals to him that these people are indeed her people, the Jewish people. So immediately the king wants to know who this person is. He wants to deal directly with this individual. He wants to get to the bottom of what this is about. And when she reveals that it's Haman who's sitting there, remember, this whole time hearing this, he's so angry, he decides to go and walk out into the garden to kind of collect his thoughts, to give him a moment to figure out what is the next step that he should take, which is something we should take an example from. When we're faced with some kind of reality that has left us stunned, we need to take a moment. We need to spend some time in prayer. We need to think carefully about what we're going to do next. So while he was out in the garden, trying to calm down, no doubt, Haman is pleading for his life, which is a big reversal to when he first walked into this banquet thinking that he was someone super special and secure in his position in the kingdom. He's pleading to such a degree that in verse 7, it tells us, verse 8, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. All right, so we see, if we can picture this in our mind, this man is desperate. He knows that evil is imminent. He needs to decide what to do. He's trying desperately to defend himself, to save his life, to try to convince the queen to intercede for him, perhaps, on his behalf. But when the king walks back in and finds Haman breaking all royal protocol here by flinging himself literally across this couch-like reclined chaise lounge that most royalty used, he was appalled that he would take such presumptuousness to get that close to the queen, to enter her, what we call her personal space this way. And the king at the end of verse 8 says, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? So the king is definitely upset at what Haman has tried to do here by so desperately pleading for his life. He probably didn't think about anything other than that, and he wanted to just get as close as he could to her and plead with her earnestly, and didn't think about what royal protocol he was breaking. You did not approach royalty in this way. You remained at a distance and you stood respectfully before the king and the queen. You did not throw yourself, across where they were sitting or lying. So the king's wrath has now really reached a point where there's no turning back now for Haman. And at the end of verse 8, it says, as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. He's now been convicted and found guilty of breaking some of the rules of royalty here, rules of the kingdom, no doubt. So they immediately cover his face as a convicted individual. One of the eunuchs, Harbonah, says to the king in verse 9, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." So he points out to the king, we have some gallows already prepared here that Haman was going to use to hang Mordecai, who, he reminds the king, saved your life. So the king's response is, hang him on it. No trial, no prolonged, sitting down and discussing things here. It's an immediate decision the king makes that Haman is going to be put to death for his crimes. The first one being writing a decree deceitfully, trying to annihilate a large number of people in the kingdom without cause. And then secondly, breaking royal protocol and approaching the queen in such a presumptuous way. So Haman is hung on the gallows, verse 10, that he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the king's wrath subsided. So that harsh reality that the king had to face here, that he had put his trust and faith in the wrong man, that his kingdom was under threat, that he had made a terrible decision. He had actually made a decision that put the queen's life in jeopardy. He decides the first step is to get rid of the person who initiated this threat. And then he does so. And that was something that was done quite often in these types of kingdoms. The king had the authority, the power to execute someone just if he decided that's what he wanted to do. We didn't do the trial system we have here in our country. He wasn't arrested, taken to jail, questioned, put in, jail, and then had a trial and jury situation. He was immediately convicted and executed. So, threat is over. Haman's gone. He's no longer there. He can't do any more harm to the kingdom, right? Is that kind of what it looks like, perhaps? No. Actually, the threat is not over because the decree is still active. It's still in force. Remember, any decree written by the king in the Medo-Persian kingdom could not be revoked, could not be changed. It had to be followed. It had to be obeyed. So that's the next dilemma that must be approached. So we see then in the beginning of chapter 8 some events that take place next. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told him he was related to her. So now, not only has she revealed that she's a Jew, she's revealed her relationship with her cousin Mordecai, that he had raised her and was therefore part of her family. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai instead. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. It was common in these kingdoms that when a criminal was convicted of a crime, his property became property of the king, of the kingdom. The king could disperse or do as he wished. In this case, he gives the house and all of its possessions and wealth to Esther. But since Esther lives in the palace, she doesn't really need a second home, and so she gives that home to Mordecai, which he probably was living in very simple living situation before this, because he was working at the gate of the palace. So not a very wealthy man. He certainly didn't care about wealth. He wasn't concerned about position, but he's going to be given the house of Haman. Of course, all of Haman's family would have been evicted from the house. His property was immediately become property of the crown, and that property could be distributed as the king saw fit. In this case, he turns it over to Esther, who in turn turns it over to Mordecai. So Mordecai receives the estate of Haman. He's given the signet ring, which places him in the same position that Haman once held, second in command in the kingdom, which in our day and age, we call that position the prime minister. Very, very important position to hold in a kingdom, especially of this size. The king now knows that not only is Esther Jewish, but she's related to this man, Mordecai. So all of this information has come at the king all in one day, where he's learned about the betrayal of Haman, the deceit and lying of Haman, the evil behind his actions. And he's also learned that Esther is Jewish and that her relative Mordecai is the one who revealed the plot to have him assassinated. So something needs to be done now about this decree. So we see in verse 3 that Esther brings this to the attention of the king. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and says, "If it pleases the king, if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Ammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen?" So after all the conversations she's had with the king, this is the first time we see an emotional response from Esther. But even though it's emotional, it's still a controlled emotion. It's not a manipulation that she's doing. She's not trying to manipulate the king here with her tears. She's sincerely grieving over the seriousness that this decree will mean to her people. And she wants to impress upon the king the importance of him doing something to revoke this decree. She points out that these Jews live in all of the king's provinces, that she could not endure the thought that her countrymen were going to be annihilated. And remember, her life also would be in jeopardy. So she is making this plea. She's down at the king's feet. He extends the golden scepter to her. She stands before the king. And if you notice the way she words her request, it's very, very interesting. I really love the way that she says this in verse 5. If it pleases the king, if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing to the king. So she's asking the king to consider her request based on whether he's pleased with her, whether he feels her request is right, whether he feels justified or accommodating to fulfill her request. She does it very respectfully, with dignity and composure, except for the first part where she was crying. But we can understand the depth of her sorrow here when she was pleading for the lives of her countrymen. We would probably be emotional as well. So she makes the request. She hopefully has reached the king's understanding here of how important this is. And we see his response in verse 7. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke." So he's given that responsibility back to Esther and Mordecai. You write the decree. You determine the wording that needs to be made so that these Jews will not be annihilated. Now, what in the world kind of decree are you going to write? Because remember, the original decree could be carried out and will be carried out. There will be people in the kingdom that are going to come and try to murder the Jewish people and plunder their possessions. So the decree has to protect them from this kind of behavior. So the decree they write is going to give the Jewish people the right, first of all, to defend themselves, which means they would be allowed to have some kind of weapon. They're going to have the license to kill from the king, which means if they murder anyone, it's not a criminal act, it's in self-defense. They were going to be allowed to protect their families, the women, the children. Remember, they were all included in the original decree. Women, children, old men, young men, didn't matter. All were going to be annihilated. And it's kind of what we would call today a genocide. They're going to be allowed to protect themselves, defend themselves, and to defend their property from being taken, which often happened when they came in and conquered a particular people or nation. They would take their property as their own possessions, kind of as a reward, you might say. So now the Jews had the permission from the king to do all of these things where they could defend themselves against any attack without fear of repercussion. Because before, if they had raised a hand against any other people in the kingdom, it would have been considered a criminal act. And therefore, they would have been subject to arrest and execution. So these letters then were written. The scribe is called in, or the scribes, in verse 9 are called in. They are now going to write down the wording that Mordecai and Esther are giving them. And they have to be written in all kinds of languages, because we probably have multiple languages that were spoken in this kingdom. So at the end of verse 9, it says, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. Whether that would have been Aramaic or Hebrew, it's uncertain, but it was written in every language needed so that every person in the kingdom could read for himself the decree the king had issued. The letters were then, it says in verse 11, it tells you what they were permitted to do. They were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. And on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So we mentioned early on in our study that the Medo-Persian Empire had one of the best road systems of their day. They also bred horses specifically for speed, and they used these royal horses to get the word out by courier to all the different provinces in the land. So that's what we see happening in verse 14. They did it with haste. They got the decree out as fast as the horses could travel. And they had a system that expedited this so that the word would get around to the kingdom in relatively good time. Not certainly what we're used to with instant messaging, but it would have gotten out in a reasonable amount of time. And we're only in the third month here. And the month of Adar is the 12th month, which was when this was supposed to take place. So we still have some time for the word to get around to all of the Jewish people in the land and for them to make preparations. Now, in verse 15 of chapter 8, it says that Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. There had not been a Jew elevated to this position in the kingdom before. If you'll recall, back in the kingdom of Babylon, Daniel was given great honor in the kingdom. But this is the Medo-Persian kingdom. So there had not been a Jew elevated to this position. Even though Queen Esther was chosen as queen, no one knew she was Jew when she was chosen. Now this man has been elevated to a position of great authority and influence in the kingdom. And knowing Mordecai's character that we have learned from the previous chapters, this will not go to his head. He is not going to become so arrogantly prideful that he will use his power in a bad way. He will only use his power and influence in a good way that would help the kingdom and the people that live there. So the Jews are rejoicing now. Their mourning has been turned to rejoicing. In verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. They felt protected. They felt valued by the king because he's going to allow them to protect themselves. They were given rights in the kingdom that made them feel joy and gladness. They now could look to being able to save themselves and their families. They would no longer be at the mercy of government officials. In verse 17, and in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now, what kind of fear this is difficult to determine from the word fear used here in the Hebrew, but it's probably referring to awe and respect. The fact that these Jews now had a decree written specifically for them by the king caused the other people in the nation to look up and take notice. And they wanted to become Jewish themselves, which was a process that was necessary or was possible. A Gentile could become a Jew by proselyting. The men, of course, had to be circumcised. They had to observe the feast and sacrifices. They had to eat the dietary food that Jewish people did. They would do their praying and their fasting and their sacrifices and observing the feast days, all of the things that the Jewish people did under the law of Moses. If you became a Jew, you would then practice these things. You didn't become a Jew by nationality, but you became a Jew religiously. Excuse me. So that's what some of these people decided to do, that they were so taken by the Jews. And the feasting and the holiday celebration that went on throughout the entire kingdom was, I'm sure, a wonderful thing to behold, because previously these people thought they were doomed and condemned to die, and they had no chance of survival and no way of changing anything. Here we see this decree being issued that's going to give them the power that they need to protect themselves. All right, nowhere in this decree is the word God mentioned. He's not mentioned at all, as we know, in the book of Esther, but we know that God's work is going on here. He's protecting his people. He's preserving the lineage of his Savior. He is doing all that he had promised Abraham he would do, that he would bless the people that blessed him and curse the people that cursed him. So we see that being carried out here in the book of Esther, where people that threatened to annihilate the Jewish nation were going to pay a price. And God was not going to sit silent and allow that to happen, but he was going to providentially give them a way to be saved and to rescue them. A lot of times in our life, we do not see the acts of God in our everyday life. A lot of the things that go on in our life, we don't recognize as being God providentially allowing them to happen. In hindsight, many times we can see that when we look back on a long degree of events in our life, we can tell that God was definitely the reason those things happened the way they did. But at the time that we're dealing with the events, We don't always recognize that this is something that God has directed or that God is allowing to happen. And in this case, we can see it so very clearly in the pages of Esther, because God is working here. He's the reason that she is queen. He's the reason that Haman was revealed to the king. He's the reason that Mordecai was elevated and promoted. And he's the reason this decree has now been written. He doesn't go in and change any of the laws of the kingdom. He doesn't bring down thunder and lightning on King Ahasuerus' head, but he works on the mind and attitude of the king through the influence of Esther, who we mentioned before had such great dignity and composure, found favor in the sight of all that she came in contact with. So you can imagine at this time of their marriage that King Ahasuerus had learned that Esther was an honorable woman and someone to pay attention to, which he does, which we are eternally grateful that he does. Her example to us today as women, is great, because we can have great influence in our communities, in our families, in the church that we're a member of, but we must do so with dignity, discretion, honor, and composure. Running in emotionally demanding things and throwing tantrums and trying to gain attention that way is never going to be successful in reaching the work that God wants us to do. God's work can only be fulfilled when we do it righteously, do it according to his word. And we have many, many scriptures throughout the Bible that talk about a woman having discretion, having control of her tongue, being a woman of strength and honor and dignity, as in Proverbs 31 tells us. So these are all examples for us as women to emulate in our own lives and work towards gaining this kind of character. If our personalities kind of work against that, if we tend to be a little bit rash or emotional in our dealings with people, then certainly time in prayer would be necessary to ask God to help us to learn composure and learn the dignity of Esther, and he will help us. He will guide us to that type of conclusion if that's truly what we're seeking for. So I hope and pray that we will all do that. We certainly have enough women in our world that try to get their way through manipulation and tantrums, but we need more women in the family, in the church, and in our communities that compose themselves with strength, honor, and dignity to carry out the work that God wants us to do as Christians. So thank you for listening to this presentation. Our next presentation will cover the last two chapters of Esther, which are chapters 9 and 10, chapter 10 being a very short chapter, but we will talk about the events of those two chapters when the Jews do indeed get to defend themselves. We'll see the result of that and how the Jews were able to persevere over their enemies. I hope that you will watch the next lesson after this one, and that you will have gained some important knowledge about Queen Esther, as well as applications that you can make to your own life. Again, I thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.